Is God knowable, and the implications of knowledge? A survey. In his Confessions, St. Augustine asks this question, quote, "Whither do I call thee, since I am in thee? Or whence canst thou enter into me? For whither can I go beyond heaven and earth, that thence my God should come into me, who hath said, I fill the heaven and the earth?" End quote. I struggle with this question because whenever I attempt to answer it, I find that the God I end up with is a God of my own imagining, a fabrication of my own fancy. There is a problem in knowing God because I cannot know God in the way in which I know anything else. The reason for this is that God is not like anything else that I know, otherwise he would not be God. And yet the quest to know God is important to me because faith loses all meaning if the pursuit of my faith is utterly lost to me. This project will attempt to unveil why exactly the God I find is always a fossil, and why we might better speak of God. A common analogy used to explain God is to say that his relationship to us is like our relationship to ants. But this cannot be true literally, because God does not belong to this world, whereas both man and ants do. I use this analogy because it reveals what is common in our attempts to describe God, in that it actually obscures the problem of knowing God. The distance situated between us and God cannot be measured. It is a void, a quality of existence that differentiates us from him. In order to cross this divide and to avoid the analogies and metaphors, Christians often employ one or both of the following strategies. A. The world is intelligible, and God made the world, therefore God is intelligible. And or B. Man is knowable, man is made in God's image, therefore God is knowable. These strategies begin with a base epistemic assumption, such as the world is intelligible or man is knowable, and then construct a complex system by which that initial assumption can appear to be proven. Doubtless, the base assumption could still be right, but it has not actually been proven because systems cannot prove their own premises. The assumption is that there is a continuity between the act of human knowing and the way God can be known. The issue finds its root in man's act of knowing. Due to the aforementioned qualitative difference of existence between creator and creation, man cannot know God in the way he knows things in the world. So what is man's act of knowing? Can we know God via man's act of knowing? Does God wish to be known in this way? If not, how can we know God? For the Thomist, objects are made up of particulars to be understood by the powers of the intellect, to be gathered up into the abstraction of the mind. Essentially, the intellect takes the images received via the senses and then abstracts those images into a concept. However, this abstraction presents a problem because it does not address the weakness of the human form. The nature of man as a subject complicates the act of knowing. The contemporary philosophers consider this, arguing that the world is not as immediately intelligible as was once thought, and so also is man not as immediately intelligible as once thought. How do they argue this? Maurice Merleau-Ponty places the source of this insight in the world itself, stating that the immediate intelligibility of man and the world, quote, hides from us in the first place the cultural world, or human world, in which almost our whole life is led, end quote. The world is not a place open and ready for our observation of it, but is rather a place wherein we impose subjective meaning. Objects and experiences are interlaced and stratified with vast layers of given experience. The body itself, according to Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and others, is a meaningful experience. In Merleau-Ponty's words, we, quote, commonly forget, in favor of a pure exteriority or of a pure interiority, the insertion of the mind in corporeality, the ambiguous relationship which we entertain with our body and correlatively with perceived things, end quote. It is this pure interiority or pure exteriority that hides how we act, how the act of knowing operates. The Thomistic strategy rigorously examines the object, but does not question the other end of the problem, the subject. If we attempt to prove man's ability to know God in the abstract without the necessary context of the body, we are constructing arguments that lack the proper function for knowledge. And so, we are presented with a further problem. Within the boundaries of the body, we lose meaning, and yet with those boundaries, we lose the ability to know anything beyond them. Once again, we meet that quality of existence that differentiates us, bounded persons, from God, who is unlimited and boundless. It is because of this that I am unable to reconcile the Thomistic idea that by knowing my being, or being with a capital B, I am able to know the Supreme Being, or vice versa. But if we cannot know God in this way, is knowing God possible at all? In the very beginning, I noted that often when we speak about God, we obscure the essential problem about knowing him. This is the case as well with our philosophical answers about him. Could our problems here be a problem with our language? Ludwig Wittgenstein argues that we often confuse the kinds of language we are using. Quote, in religious discourse, we use such expressions as, I believe that so-and-so will happen, and use them differently to the way in which we use them in science. End quote. As he notes throughout his lectures on religious belief, the criterion by which religious belief is described is often different than scientific belief. This insight by Wittgenstein is key to understanding how we may or may not know God. For Wittgenstein, our language of God is a grammar through which we are communicating values and beliefs, or in other words, our religious concepts. So it is important to remember that when we speak of God, even if we are not speaking correctly, we are still communicating something. For Wittgenstein, however, we cannot get at something without language, and yet anything beyond language becomes nonsense. In other words, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. The limits of language are distinctly tied to this world, so this becomes yet another limitation of embodied existence. So can our language reach God? Wittgenstein, the pseudo-Dionysius, and Thomas Aquinas all seem to disagree. Dionysius proclaims that the only way in which God may be honestly approached is through the deconstruction of language, or the divine silence. David Burrell, in his book Aquinas, God and Action, argues, quote, nothing is learned directly about God by insisting that he must be good, limitless, unchangeable, and one. Rather, Aquinas shows how these predicates are equivalent to the key predicate simple, which in turn serves as a systematic reminder that nothing can be said about God. We can begin to see a picture forming. Rather, we can see a void forming between the frame where picture should be. This conviction that nothing can be said about God is the final note in Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Quote, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. The God that I create through my language and inquiry is made so because the grammar that I construct to speak about him is unable to traverse that qualitative difference of experience between him and I. I begin to think that my entire system of inquiry is incorrect. Does God want to be known in this way? What we know of him through history seems to answer in the negative. Two biblical texts seem most appropriate for understanding how God wishes he should be understood. In the first, Exodus 3:14, we see God prior to the historical incarnation defining himself. In the second, Matthew 16, verse 17, God in the incarnation defines how he is understood. A quick exegesis of both of these texts is helpful in further discerning the issues. In Exodus 3, verses 13 through 14, when Moses asks God, quote, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What do I tell them? End quote. Before considering God's response, consider the structure of Moses' question. He defines God as the God of the Israelites' ancestors. This places and defines God not within some sort of ontological or mystical system, but rather relationally. God responds, quote, I am who I am, end quote, and, quote, tell the Israelites the I am has sent you, end quote. With this response, God intentionally obscures his identity. Why? In Matthew 16, verses 13 through 20, Jesus questions his disciples regarding his identity. He asks them, who do people say that the Son of Man is? They respond saying that some people believe he is John the Baptist, others the prophet Elijah, others Jeremiah, or any number of the prophets. Notice here as well that Jesus' identity is now publicly obfuscated or hidden, difficult to understand, shrouded in mystery. He then asks them, but who do you say that I am? Notice here the correlation between this question and the answer given by God in Exodus 3:14. Simon Peter answers this time, quote, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, end quote. To this, Jesus praises him, but remarks something peculiar. He says, quote, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father, end quote. Once again, his identity is obfuscated. Not only is his identity actually further complicated by Jesus' praise of St. Peter, but he intentionally draws the source of St. Peter's knowledge away from this world. Jesus is saying, your knowledge has not brought you to this, but God himself has given this to you. Therefore, even though God incarnate stands before him, Peter does not gather his knowledge of Jesus through worldly evidence or right reason. What does this mean? God himself propagates the divine silence. I realize that in attempting to cross the gap between God and myself, God is the one empowering the distance between us. He is continually shifting beyond my perception, outside of reach, becoming a void where language falls apart and nothing can be said of him. I cannot reach him in this way. We often confuse a good argument, one that is complex, well-structured, and logically sound, for that which proves its conclusion. However, this is not how we can possibly prove whether or not we can know God, only that a belief in God can be suitably reasonable. In my quest to know God, I continually run into the obstacle of my own inability to answer my question. But what if I am asking the wrong question? Martin Buber notices the same problem. In asking the question, can I know God, I lock myself into the world of objects. But God is not an object, nor is he a thing to be known. And, as a subject, my experience of this world of objects is subjective and relational. This is what Buber calls the world of relationship, or I-it. Like Wittgenstein, Buber believes our apprehension of language is our representation of the world, yet he makes the distinction that, quote, primary words do not signify things, but they intimate relations, end quote. From here, he overturns the way in which we understand the world of relations, saying, quote, I perceive something, I am sensible of something, I imagine something, I will something, I feel something, I think something. The life of human beings does not consist of all this and the like alone, end quote. Therefore, there is a second realm of relations, the I and thou. The world that is presented to man through experiences alone present him only with a world composed of it and he and she and it again. What therefore is this other dimension that Buber intimates? It is not the difference between some outward life or perception and some inner reality, states Buber. Quote, if we add inner or outer experiences, nothing in the situation is changed. We are merely following the uneternal design that springs from the lust of the human race to whittle away the secret of death. Inner things or outer things, what are they but things and things, end quote. So can anything be known outside of this world of things and things? Yes, says Buber, for to consider an other as a thou is to remove them from the world of things and things. To quote Dr. Yates, quote, the encounter with the thou is a communication of being, an encounter with I am, who cannot not be. For Buber, the distance between ourselves and God, is not traversable at all if is considered only within the world of things. Quote, only when I step out of the primary world do I experience thou once more. In the act of experience, thou is far away. In other words, in order to know God, we cannot do so within the Cartesian system, but we must know him in another sense altogether. The base assumption of this idea can be demonstrated philosophically and sociologically. At its base, Buber's idea believes that humans are essentially social and therefore relational beings. We are made individuals in communion with and in isolation from the whole context of the social reality. This is demonstrated in the 1966 essay Society as a Human Product by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. It is argued that, quote, man's self-production is always and of necessity a social enterprise, end quote. To view man as an individual is to at the same moment see him as a social creature, or, quote, man's specific humanity and sociality are inextricably intertwined, end quote. The philosophy of intersubjective knowledge defines this similarly, arguing that the I of self can only be understood ultimately in reference to the thou of the other. Note that this is different from the initial strategy to prove God's existence, that I know being, therefore I know God, because it is a consideration distinct from the world of things. The distance between ourselves and God is not crossed, but overturned in the revelation of the I and the thou relationship, because intrinsic within the personal identity of the I is the eternal identity of the thou. Just as the short sociological examination before, when we proclaim ourselves as an I, we are also referencing the thou. Most importantly, the I and thou reveals to us this new kind of knowledge, an entirely different kind of being. The I and thou relationship, if it is correct, works within the limitations of the body and the limitations of language. Most importantly, it understands correctly that of that which we cannot speak, we must remain silent. It is difficult to draw a clean conclusion from this information because the I and thou relationship needs to be further examined, and that is a conversation for another time. To speak of God is merely to encounter confusion and silence. We must rather speak around God in such a way so that the soft image of something appears. What is left is a world of relation outside of the Cartesian system, one that is a direct encounter with I and thou. How the person engages in this new type of relation is not clear yet, but it is not clear that going back to the traditional modes of God speak is an option. The person who searches for God, who questions him as St. Augustine did, must do so with epistemic honesty, noting his inability to prove God's existence through the Cartesian system, or, indeed, the medieval one.